You know that feeling when you see a really energetic kid and you wonder, is this just a normal kid thing or is it something more? It's a question that tons of parents and teachers ask themselves. So today, let's unpack that together and look at ADHD from a clinical perspective.
To really get to the heart of this, let's start with a scenario that just perfectly lays out this huge challenge in clinical psychology.
Okay, so on one hand, you've got 4-year-old Michael. He just can't sit still through a whole movie, right? But at preschool, his teacher says he gets along great with the other kids. Then you've got 10-year-old Jake. His behaviors feel a lot more pronounced. He's up and down from the dinner table constantly, can't seem to finish his homework, and his friends get frustrated with him for losing focus during games. Now, here's the kicker. On the surface, their behavior seems kinda similar, but from a clinical standpoint, they are worlds apart.
So that's the big question, isn't it? How do we, or how do clinicians, draw that line? Michael might just be, well, being a totally normal 4-year-old. But Jake's struggles, they could be pointing toward a neurodevelopmental disorder. The answer isn't something you can figure out just by looking once. It takes a systematic evaluation that's based on solid scientific criteria.
This is why it is so important to move past simple labels like bad behavior. We have to understand what ADHD actually is, clinically speaking.
So here's the official take. ADHD is a common neurodevelopmental disorder. It is not a sign of bad parenting or poor discipline. At its very core, it's about having trouble with self-direction, things like being able to sustain your attention, manage your behavior, and stop yourself from acting on impulse, especially when there's a lot going on around you.
And ADHD really has two main sides to it. First, you've got the hyperactivity and impulsivity cluster. That's the stuff we can usually see, the restlessness, the fidgeting, acting without really thinking through the consequences. Then you have the attention deficit cluster. Now this is crucial. This is not about having a bad memory like you'd see in dementia. It's about challenges with what we call executive functions, the brain's management system. Think organizing a project, holding information in your head while you work with it, or following a bunch of instructions in a row.
So, for a diagnosis to actually be legitimate, a clinician needs to see all three of these things happening at the same time. 1, the symptoms have to be causing real problems in their life, either at school or with friends. 2, these issues can't just happen in one place. They have to show up consistently in at least 2 different settings, like at home and at school. And finally, the behaviors have to be truly out of sync for the person's age. Getting this right is absolutely essential so we don't end up mislabeling normal childhood energy as a disorder.
Okay, so we've covered the what, but how about the why? Let's move from the behavior to the biology and bust some of the biggest myths about what causes ADHD, using what science actually shows us. And here are the 2 big ones you've probably heard a million times. It's got to be inconsistent parenting, right? Or maybe they're just eating way too much sugar. So, what's the real story?
Well, after decades of research, the answer is a clear, loud and proud, definitive no. Science has completely debunked the idea that sugar causes hyperactivity. And listen, while parenting a child with ADHD can be incredibly tough, those parenting challenges aren't the cause of ADHD. More often than not, they are a response to the daily reality of managing a child's impulsive behavior.
So if it's not sugar or parenting, what is going on? Well, the huge piece of the puzzle is genetics. This number you see, 0.74, is what's called the heritability coefficient. It basically means that about 74% of the differences we see in ADHD traits across the population come down to genetic factors. That is a massive indicator of just how strong the biological roots are.
And to really put that number into perspective, think about this. The heritability of ADHD is almost as high as the heritability of your height. We all just accept that our height is mostly determined by our genes, right? Well, the science is telling us we should be thinking about ADHD in a very similar way.
And these genetic differences actually show up in the brain itself. Brain scans have shown that there can be reduced volume in parts of the brain that are critical for that executive function and impulse control we talked about, like the prefrontal cortex. On a chemical level, ADHD affects key brain messengers like dopamine and serotonin. Now, there are some environmental risk factors, sure, things like low birth weight or prenatal exposure to toxins, but the main engine driving ADHD is biology.
And knowing about these deep biological roots helps us bust another really common myth, the idea that kids just grow out of ADHD. Long-term research tells a very different story. For many people, this is a lifelong condition.
In fact, studies showed that for about 65% of kids diagnosed with ADHD, those core symptoms are going to follow them right into adulthood. The condition doesn't just disappear when you turn 18, it just often changes the way it shows up.
And when ADHD goes unrecognized in an adult, the consequences can be really serious. We see higher risks for depression, constant struggles with work and school performance, more conflict in relationships, and even a greater chance of getting into high-risk behaviors. This is exactly why getting an accurate diagnosis, even if it happens later in life, can be absolutely life-changing.
But here is the really hopeful part. These outcomes are not a foregone conclusion, not at all. We now have incredibly effective, science-backed ways to manage ADHD and lower those risks.
The best approach we have is what experts call the multimodal model. And it's not about finding one single magic bullet. It's a team effort. It combines medication to help manage the core symptoms, parent management training to give parents the tools and skills to create effective behavioral strategies at home, and interventions at school to make sure the learning environment is set up for success.
And that gets to the real goal of any intervention. We're not trying to cure ADHD. The point is to manage the challenges, to prevent those secondary problems like anxiety or low self-esteem from popping up, and, this is the best part, to help individuals learn how to use their unique strengths and really thrive.
Which brings us full circle to our final and maybe the most important point of all. We need to shift this entire conversation from one of judgment and stigma to one of genuine understanding. At the end of the day, ADHD is not a character flaw. It's not a moral feeling or a sign that someone isn't smart. It is a well-understood difference in how a brain develops. When we can finally replace stigma with science, we create a world where people with ADHD aren't just managed, they're supported and empowered to turn their neurological differences into incredible strengths. So what do you think might change if we all started seeing this variation not as a deficit, but just as a different way of experiencing the world?